There's a specific moment when the empath stops feeling too much and starts seeing too much. And when that happens, something inside them shifts like a door closing without slamming. It's not anger. It's not revenge. It's not wounded pride. It's clarity. A clarity so silent that from the outside it looks like coldness weighing, but inside it feels like liberation. The empath is usually described as someone sensitive, compassionate, with a kind of emotional radar. They walk into a room and pick up the vibe before anyone says a thing. They notice the tension hidden in a smile. They feel the sadness behind a joke. They carry the weight of the unsaid. And often because of that, they become a house without doors. Everyone comes in, leans on them, unloads, asks for shelter, asks for comfort, asks for guidance, and rarely asks if anyone still lives there. At first, this sensitivity seems like a pure virtue. I just want to help. I can't stand to see someone suffering. If I can ease the pain, why not? And in fact, there's nobility in that. But Carl Jung would warn us calmly, every virtue that hasn't been examined can turn into a mask, and every mask, when glued to the face, turns into destiny. Because the empath, without realizing it, can use their own kindness as a persona, that social face we present to the world to be accepted, recognized, loved. The empath's persona is the good one, the understanding one, the strong one, the mature one. It's someone who endures, someone who gets it, someone who doesn't abandon. And that, in the eyes of others, is almost irresistible. The figure who welcomes, who always has a little more patience, who's available even when exhausted. But there's an invisible cost, and the invisible cost is always collected with interest. The truth we're talking about today isn't the truth about others. It's not just the day the empath realizes who's narcissistic, who's manipulative, who takes advantage. That might happen, but it's not the core. The decisive truth, the one that makes the empath leave, is the truth about themselves. It's when they realize that in many moments they weren't just loving, they were trying to fix. They weren't just caring, they were buying peace. They weren't just being loyal, they were avoiding an old fear. And the question that starts echoing is terrible and simple. Do I do this out of love or out of need? Jung would call this moment a confrontation with the shadow. The shadow isn't evil in a moral sense. The shadow is what we don't accept in ourselves, what we push into the basement of the psyche because we think it doesn't fit the image we want to have. And, paradoxically, the empath's shadow often isn't aggressive. It can be something that sounds ugly to admit: built-up resentment, thirst for validation, need to be indispensable, fear of rejection, guilt as a form of control, the secret pleasure of being the only one who understands. It's hard to say that, and that's why it stays in the basement. But the basement doesn't stay empty. What's repressed doesn't disappear. It changes shape. And one of the most common shapes is projection. The empath projects outward what they can't recognize inside. For example, they can spot the other's fragility with scary accuracy and fall in love with the idea of healing that fragility, because acknowledging their own fragility still hurts. They can tolerate someone else's emotional chaos for years, because that keeps them from facing their own silent chaos. They can fixate on saving someone, because that way they don't have to admit they need saving too, or at the very least, need boundaries. And then comes the day when the empath can't take it anymore. But it's not an explosive can't take it. It's a can't take it that's matured, a tiredness that's turned into philosophy, an exhaustion that's turned into self-knowledge. That day is usually preceded by small cracks. They start noticing that reciprocity doesn't come, that the thank you is short, that the promised change never materializes, that the conversation always circles back to the other's pain, the other's drama, the other's problem. They start noticing their own body, the tension in the jaw, the broken sleep, the anxiety before a message, the feeling of always walking on eggshells. And, maybe the most painful, they start noticing that their compassion has been hijacked by guilt. Guilt for saying no, guilt for pulling away, guilt for not responding fast, guilt for prioritizing their own life. And then a Jungian insight hits like a silent lightning bolt. Sometimes guilt isn't a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that you're breaking an old pact with your persona. The empath's persona says, you only have value if you're useful. You only deserve love if you're understanding. You're only good if you endure. And the world reinforces that in 1,000 ways. There are people who praise the empath like they're praising a tool. You're amazing. You always save me. And the empath smiles, but inside feels a kind of emptiness. Because being loved for what you do, and not for who you are, starts to feel like a well-decorated prison. This is where the video's theme lights up strong. Why does the empath leave when they understand the truth about themselves? Because they discover that staying in certain relationships isn't virtue, it's repetition. And repetition, in Jung, is a sign of a complex. Complexes are autonomous emotional cores, old wounds organized around memories, beliefs, and effects that keep acting in adult life like an internal character. The empath might carry the caretaker complex, the one who learned early that love came when they were mature, when they didn't cause trouble, when they took care of others. Maybe they were the kid who mediated fights, who consoled an adult, who tried to keep the peace. And that kid grew up. But the internal script stayed. So as an adult, they find people with intense wounds and feel a calling. It's not just attraction, it's familiarity. The other's pain feels like a language they learned early, and they confuse that with destiny. They confuse intensity with depth. They confuse need with bond. And for a while it works. They feel needed. They feel good. They feel like someone with purpose. But the psyche demands coherence. The self, that organizing center of personality in Jung, doesn't tolerate a life based on self-abandonment forever. It might take years. It might take decades. But there comes a point where the body starts saying no before the mind does. The body starts refusing the role. The truth then appears. I was trying to be loved at the price of losing myself. I was calling compassion what was also fear. I was calling loyalty what was also attachment. And that truth, once seen, can't be unseen. The empath leaves because they understand that some people don't want to be healed. They want to be sustained. And sustaining what doesn't change isn't love. It's servitude. They leave because they understand that being the one who endures everything feeds the worst deception, that their presence is infinite. They leave because they realize that their own sensitivity, without boundaries, turns into an open wound. And no one can live with their heart exposed all the time. But notice, leaving isn't necessarily cutting with hate. Often it's just stopping to offer yourself as a sacrifice. It's leaving the other with their own responsibility. It's abandoning the role, not humanity. It's giving the other a chance to face their own shadow, without the empath as anesthesia. And maybe the most important sentence in this introduction is this. The empath doesn't leave because they stopped loving. They leave because they finally started loving themselves without apologizing. The empath leaves when they understand that feeling deeply doesn't mean abandoning themselves deeply. And that understanding is the start of individuation, the path to becoming whole, not perfect. There's a type of pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't make a scene, doesn't threaten, doesn't demand. It just drains. The empath knows this pain well because often it's in that pain that they learn to be good. And that's exactly why, when they start understanding the truth about themselves, they don't argue anymore. They simply withdraw, like closing a book they've already read to the end and don't need to reread to prove anything. In Jungian terms, the empath usually lives with a strong identification with the caretaker persona. That persona is socially admirable, someone who listens, who welcomes, who endures, who keeps calm. The problem is that when the person confuses themselves with the mask, they lose access to what they really feel. And then the empath becomes an expert at perceiving others' emotions while becoming an amateur at recognizing their own needs. They can map the other's sadness like a cartographer, but can't name their own exhaustion without feeling guilty. That guilt, by the way, is a central clue. Jung would say that guilt hits hard when the psyche is trying to prevent a change that threatens the character you've been playing for years. The empath, when starting to set boundaries, feels guilt not because they're doing wrong, but because they're betraying an old internal contract. The contract that they only deserve love if they're useful, available, understanding, almost inexhaustible. That contract is rarely conscious. It was written early in situations where being sensitive was also being responsible before time. That's why the empath often feels drawn to emotionally turbulent people. The other's turbulence activates a complex, an emotional core that wakes up and takes the wheel. The person isn't just relating, they're repeating a script. And the script says, if I can love enough, understand enough, be patient enough, then finally I'll be chosen. Finally I'll be seen. Finally I'll be safe. The empath calls that love, but there's a hidden component, an attempt at redemption of an old wound. Here's a delicate but liberating point. The empath isn't always just a victim. They can, without realizing, occupy a position of moral superiority. Not the aggressive kind, but the silent superiority of someone who prides themselves on enduring more than others. They see themselves as the one who sustains, who understands, who doesn't give up. And that can turn into a subtle form of control. I stay, therefore I'm better. I endure, therefore I'm right. That's a shadow hard to admit, because it seems to contradict the image they have of themselves. But Jung would teach us, what we deny in ourselves doesn't disappear, it just manifests behind the scenes. And when the empath touches that truth, a kind of shame appears. Not the shame that destroys, but the one that awakens. It's like realizing that their own kindness was used as currency. Not out of conscious malice, but out of psychic need. They start to see that by saving the other, they were also avoiding looking at themselves. By solving the other's drama, they were postponing their own life. By listening for hours and hours, they didn't have to speak. By being the safe harbor, they didn't have to admit they wanted a harbor too. That moment is a milestone of individuation, which in Jung is the process of becoming whole. Not becoming perfect. It's integrating the rejected parts, including those that seem ugly, to our ideal. For the empath, integrating the shadow can mean accepting their own legitimate anger, their own limit, their own need for rest, their own desire for reciprocity, their own right to say no without over-explaining. It can mean accepting that compassion without boundaries turns into self-destruction. And self-destruction isn't virtue, it's disguised escape. The Stoics help a lot here because they remind us of a simple division that reorganizes the soul. What depends on me and what doesn't depend on me. Epictetus would be almost relentless. You can offer presence, honesty, and good intention, but you can't guarantee the other's maturity, or the other's transformation, or the other's gratitude. The empath suffers because they try to cross that boundary. They try to do the impossible, control someone's heart and choices through their own giving. And the more they give, the more they believe they're investing. But emotional investment, when it turns into debt, turns into resentment. Seneca would have advice that seems harsh but is deeply human. Generosity needs measure, not because helping is wrong, but because the mind needs to preserve its stability to act rightly. A kindness that breaks you isn't kindness, it's a fire. Marcus Aurelius, in turn, would say something like, do good without becoming hostage to the good. Virtue doesn't require you to be exploited. Virtue requires you to be integral. The empath starts to change when they understand that integrity isn't being good all the time. Integrity is being true. And the truth often is, I can't stay here without losing myself. Or even, I confused compassion with obligation. When they recognize that, self-abandonment becomes unbearable. Not because they became selfish, but because they became lucid. Notice what usually happens before the final departure. The empath tries to talk calmly, tries to explain, tries to give chances. But inside, they're already different. They see patterns with clarity. The other only changes when there's risk of loss, only apologizes when the consequence hits, only promises when they're about to be left. And the empath notices something else. They themselves lived for years reacting to the other, instead of choosing their own direction. They lived as if the center of life was someone else's emotional balance. That tires in a way that's not just psychological, it's existential. Jung would speak at this point of an archetype very present in the empath's psyche. The martyr, the savior, the wounded healer. These are collective ancient images that give meaning to suffering. The problem is when the meaning turns into dependency. The person needs to suffer to feel useful, needs to be necessary to feel value, and when the other improves or when the other leaves, the empath feels an emptiness because their identity was tied to the role. So, the big turnaround isn't just discovering that the other is like that. The big turnaround is discovering that I have a pattern too, that I participate in the dance too. And from there they realize that leaving isn't punishment, it's soul hygiene. There's a very clear sign that the truth has been understood. The empath stops trying to justify themselves. Before, they explained too much, gave long texts, made lists of reasons, apologized for feeling, tried to be understood. Now they prefer silence. They don't need to convince. They don't need to win. They just need to get out of the place where they cease to exist. That doesn't mean they become cold. It means they learn a higher form of compassion, compassion with structure. To have compassion isn't to absorb. To understand isn't to accept everything. To help isn't to carry someone on your back for life. And sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do is not participate in the repetition anymore. The empath also learns to notice the difference between love and fusion. Fusion is when you lose yourself to keep the bond. Love is when you preserve yourself and still offer presence. Fusion has urgency, anxiety, fear of abandonment. Love has firmness, freedom, and respect. The empath, when they don't know themselves, confuses fusion with destiny. When they know themselves, they recognize fusion as an old request from their nervous system for safety, and decide not to obey that request blindly. And that's where the exit becomes inevitable. Because once they see the mechanism, staying would be lying to themselves again. It would be calling patience what is fear. It would be calling understanding what is denial. It would be calling loyalty what is self-abandonment. The empath leaves when they understand the truth about themselves, because they finally realize that their life wasn't made to be an extension of someone else's storm. They weren't born to be everyone's shelter and no one's home. They start building a life that doesn't depend on being necessary to have value. And in that moment, they choose the hardest and simplest path, returning to themselves. There comes a point where the empath isn't arguing with people anymore. They're arguing with symbols, with internal images, with old ghosts disguised as current relationships. And when that becomes clear, leaving stops being an emotional act and becomes a psychological one. They leave to stop feeding a story that's no longer true. Jung said, in essence, that we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. That's not pessimism. It's a reminder that the psyche interprets. And the empath, with their heightened sensitivity, interprets with a lot of intensity. They read micro-expressions, silences, changes in tone. But the danger is that they can also read meanings where there's just emptiness, or potential where there's just repetition. The empath falls in love not just with the person, but with the possibility. They see the wounded child behind the tough adult. They notice the fear behind the arrogance, the insecurity behind the control. And that triggers an almost automatic impulse. If I love right, this will heal. But that phrase, when you examine it honestly, reveals a confusion. It turns love into technique, as if loving were a method of intervention, as if care were a key that opens any door, and mainly, as if the other's transformation depended on the empath's effort. Here's where the wounded healer archetype comes in, so present in Jung. There are people who learn early to identify others' pain because, in their own childhood, they needed to anticipate moods, avoid explosions, appease environments. Sensitivity becomes a survival skill. And later in adult life, that skill becomes identity. I am the one who understands. I am the one who welcomes. I am the one who saves. It's beautiful, but dangerous, because a survival skill shouldn't become your home. When the empath matures, they start realizing that many relationships were chosen by the nervous system, not the heart. The body recognizes familiar patterns and calls it connection. The mind romanticizes and calls it soul. But deep down, it's the old script seeking repetition to finally win the past. It's as if the psyche said, This time I'll manage to fix it. This time it'll work. This time I'll be loved without having to beg. That's a crucial point. The empath often tries to win the past with present tools. They try with adult patience to resolve a childhood lack. And that's unfair to themselves. Jung would say that, when we don't face our unconscious contents, they appear as destiny. The person swears they're always finding the same type of people, as if the world conspired. But often it's their own psyche choosing similar scenarios to stage the same drama with hope for a different ending. The difference is that the ending never changes, because the script stays the same. The empath gives too much, hopes the other awakens, tolerates the intolerable, excuses what hurts them, explains what shouldn't need explaining, and in the end, feels emptied. The truth about themselves, at this stage, comes as a bare phrase. I betrayed myself to not be abandoned. And when that phrase lands, the empath understands why they feel so tired. They were living a life where their yes was, in fact, a no against themselves. That's where the shadow appears in a more mature form. The empath discovers that behind the kindness there was fear of conflict. Behind the understanding there was fear of being seen as bad. Behind the patience there was fear of being alone. And they realize something even deeper. Part of them didn't want the other to improve fast because the savior role gave meaning and identity. That's an intimate confession that almost no one says out loud. But Jung would teach us that healing starts when we stop wanting to seem good and start wanting to be whole. Being whole means accepting the paradox. I can be compassionate and still not stay. I can understand the other's story and still not accept being hurt. I can wish well and still choose distance. That's emotional maturity. It's a compassion that doesn't confuse itself with sacrifice. In Stoicism, this translates as mastery of one's own ascent. For Epictetus, it's not the event that dominates us, but the judgment we make of it. The empath suffers because they give assent to a dangerous judgment. If I pull away, I'll be cruel. If I say no, I'll be selfish. If I set boundaries, I'll lose love. The inner work is to dismantle those judgments and replace them with truer ones. I'm not responsible for anyone else's emotional maturity. Boundary isn't punishment, it's form. I can love without offering myself in holocaust. Marcus Aurelius would remind us of something simple. You don't need to hate to pull away. You just need to be faithful to what's worthy. And worthiness, here, doesn't have to do with pride. It has to do with the dignity of existing as a subject, not as a tool. Many empaths, when they finally understand the truth about themselves, discover they were trapped in a kind of invisible contract with suffering. They confused peace with guilt. When they were at peace, they felt something was missing, as if the mind said, "You're not doing enough." That's typical of someone conditioned to earn value through care. So, individuation requires a rupture, learning to rest without justifying, learning to live without saving, learning to be without proving. And when the empath starts practicing that, the world reacts. Some people find it strange, others accuse. You've changed. You've become cold. You're different. And yes, they are different. They've stopped being predictable. They've stopped being the eternal source. And that scares those who fed off their constancy. But that other's fear isn't proof that the empath is wrong. Sometimes it's just proof that the old dynamic depended on the absence of boundaries. Another point that awakens the empath is realizing they confused emotional intensity with intimacy. True intimacy isn't living in peaks and drops. Intimacy is security, reciprocity, consistent presence, respect. Intimacy is being able to say no without fear of punishment. It's being able to fail without being used. It's being able to be human. When the empath realizes the relationship doesn't offer that, they understand that what existed there was often an emotional addiction, a dependence on affective adrenaline, dramatic reconciliations, promises, crises. And then a new internal criterion emerges. Does this bring me closer to myself or take me away from myself? That question is practically a compass for individuation. The empath starts measuring relationships not by how much they feel, but by how much they preserve themselves. Not by how much they understand, but by how much they respect themselves. Not by how much they endure, but by how much it makes them more whole. And that's why, when they leave, they do it without fanfare. They've already mourned inside. They've already said goodbye to the fantasy. They've already seen the truth. You can't love someone out of their own chaos if that person doesn't want to leave. And you can't build an emotional home on unstable ground, offering your own body as foundation. Leaving, in that sense, is a psychic ritual. It's the death of a persona, the death of the me who always saves, the death of the me who endures everything. And every symbolic death, no matter how painful, opens space for a truer life. The empath leaves when they understand the truth about themselves because they realize that their sensitivity isn't an invitation to be invaded. It's emotional intelligence that needs direction. They learn that compassion without wisdom turns into an open door for repetition. And finally, they choose wisdom. Not the one that accuses the world, but the one that reorganizes their own interior. There's a kind of silence that is born when the empath finally finds themselves. It's not the silence of someone who's given up on the world. It's the silence of someone who stopped abandoning themselves to keep being accepted. And if you look closely, you'll see that this kind of silence isn't empty. It's full of order. It's full of a no that doesn't need a shout to be true. When the empath leaves, a lot of people interpret it as ingratitude, as coldness, as sudden change. But what happened inside wasn't sudden. It was a long process of internal listening. It was the repetition of small concessions that started hurting too much. It was the sum of sleepless nights, conversations that never went anywhere, promises that turned to dust, requests for understanding that only went one way. It was, above all, the moment when they realized something decisive. What they called love was, in part, turning into a way to erase themselves. And that realization changes everything, because the empath starts to understand that there's no possible healing when they become the other's compulsory medicine. The medicine that's always available, the medicine that never tires, the medicine that never demands reciprocity, the medicine that swallows its own sadness to keep the peace. And yet, no human soul was made to live as medicine. The soul was made to live as presence, and presence requires boundary. In Jung's view, that instant is the start of a truer life, because individuation is exactly that, stopping living as a character and starting to live as a person. And that includes recognizing parts you've spent your life trying to hide. It includes recognizing legitimate anger, natural limit, need for rest, honest desire to be cared for too. It includes recognizing that compassion can coexist with distance. That understanding the other's story doesn't mean offering yourself as a stage for the same drama to keep being played out. There's something deeply liberating, and at the same time painful, in the moment when the empath realizes they were trying to save someone to avoid facing an intimate truth. They were afraid too. Afraid of being rejected, afraid of being seen as insufficient, afraid of being abandoned. And behind that fear was an old habit, the habit of earning love through emotional effort, as if love were something they need to conquer with patience, with tolerance, with giving, with silence, with work. As if being loved were a kind of payment for being good. But what is being good anyway? Is being good destroying yourself in the name of an idea? Is being good staying where you become smaller? Is being good tolerating disrespect because you understand the other's wound? Is being good accepting crumbs with gratitude because you're afraid to ask for the whole loaf? The empath, when they mature, starts answering those questions with honesty. And honesty brings a kind of sobriety. They realize there are relationships that aren't bridges. They're abysses. And staying too long in the abyss doesn't prove love. It just proves you forgot you deserve solid ground too. The Stoics would say that freedom starts when you give back to the world what belongs to the world and take on what belongs to you. Epictetus would repeat, without poetry and without cruelty, that you only control your choices, your posture, your decisions. You don't control if the other will mature. You don't control if the other will take responsibility. You don't control if the other will finally see you. And trying to control that through giving is a very common prison, the prison of hope used as anesthesia. Seneca would remind that even virtue needs measure, because without measure, good becomes imprudence. And imprudence, although it seems generous, is often just an elegant way to flee the necessary conflict. The empath flees conflict because they were conditioned to believe that conflict is abandonment, so they endure, swallow, adapt. But life doesn't respect a person who doesn't respect themselves, and the heart doesn't either. Marcus Aurelius, if he could whisper something to the empath, might say, "Be just." And justice applies to you too. There's no virtue in treating yourself as second class. There's no wisdom in always putting yourself last. Stoic serenity isn't submissive calm. It's a calm that comes from internal rightness. And internal rightness requires that you stop bargaining with yourself. That's why, when the empath leaves, they're not committing betrayal. They're interrupting a repetition. They're saying to their own unconscious, "I don't need this role anymore to exist." And that's huge, because that role was usually built early as a form of survival. It was the child who learned to be easy, understanding, mature. It was the child who noticed the adult's moods were unstable, and so they became an antenna, a radar, a caretaker. But childhood ends, but some emotional contracts keep being signed in the dark. Leaving is tearing up the contract. And tearing that contract hurts because guilt tries to stop it. Guilt says, "You're abandoning." But over time, the empath learns to respond, "I'm returning to myself." Guilt says, "You're being selfish." And they learn to respond, "I'm being responsible." Guilt says, "You'll be alone." And they learn to respond, "Better alone than absent from myself." That's the point where the empath's psychology becomes a path of maturity, not a sentence. Sensitivity stops being an open wound and becomes an instrument. The empath learns to feel without absorbing, learns to perceive without merging, learns to welcome without nullifying themselves, learns that not every pain needs their hands. Some pains just need consequence, time, and the responsibility of their own owner. And something surprising happens when they start living like that. Life gets simpler. Not necessarily easier, but simpler. They start choosing with more sobriety. They observe consistency, not discourse. They notice actions, not promises. They get close to those with emotional responsibility, not those with just charisma and storm. They start building relationships where sensitivity isn't exploited, but respected. And maybe the most important, they learn that loving isn't losing yourself. Loving is staying whole in the other's presence. And if the other's presence requires you to fall apart, then that's not love. It's an altar. And no one should turn their own heart into an altar for someone else's immaturity. So if you're an empath and notice you're reaching this point of clarity, don't rush to blame yourself. Listen to what your tiredness is trying to say. Listen to what your body is trying to protect. Listen to what your soul has been repeating in silence. Because sometimes, what you call weakness is in fact the start of your strength. And what you call distance is in fact the start of your return. It's not that the empath stops caring. It's that they learn to care in a more dignified way. A way that doesn't require self-abandonment. A way that doesn't use their own sensitivity as punishment. A way that understands a simple, adult, almost tranquil truth. Your life is a sacred place too, and not everyone can enter. If something here touched you in an intimate way, hold a moment of silence after the video ends. And then, if it makes sense, like the video, subscribe to the channel for more reflections like this. Share it with someone who lives carrying the world on their back, and comment, what was the hardest truth you ever had to admit about yourself?